If you were living in Sydney in the 1970s, billboards were a common sight along the roadsides and on buildings and public transport. Commonly, these billboards were advertising various brands of tobacco and alcohol, often featuring sexist themes of beautiful young women in bikinis or macho men promoting smoking and drinking. Probably most prominent on the billboards was the actor Paul Hogan, aka Crocodile Dundee, who was usually seen on TV, billboards and print media flogging Winfield cigarettes or Foster's Lager. Then, around the late 70s, many of these billboards started being refaced by graffiti artists with messages that opposed the tobacco and alcohol ads. They cleverly reworked the messages and highlighted the dangers of these deadly products. It wasn't restricted to tobacco and alcohol ads. Many other products and companies were targeted by a movement known as B.U.G.A Up. Over the following years, the B.U.G.A Up movement grew, and its message and billboard reface campaigns spread across Australia until eventually the political pressure was so great that Australian politicians were forced to acknowledge the dangers of these products. They were amongst, if not the first, to enact laws banning tobacco advertising, which is now completely forbidden. Thanks to these laws, they must comply to a very strictly enforced greenish-brown coloured package with the brand name and product text limited to a very small font. Additionally, the vast majority of the package must display government-designed health warnings and rather shocking images of smoke-damaged lungs with cancer, or people with smoking-related illnesses, and even some images of people who have died from smoking-related illness. The tobacco laws also require retailers to keep all tobacco products locked away in unmarked and unbranded secure cabinets, thereby keeping them out of sight from everyone. This probably seems extreme, perhaps even draconian to people from other countries, but pretty much everyone in Australia is cool with it and understand the need to enforce strict conditions on the tobacco companies who have killed generations of people with their toxic products. Recently, I came across a photo of a refaced 1980s billboard on the internet. I was reminded of those incredibly poignant and clever attacks against the insidious tobacco and alcohol industries. So what then is the story behind the graffiti artists and their fearless campaign to bring an end to tobacco advertising back in the 1980s and 90s? Who were they, and what is their legacy? Well, this podcast is about to give you the full story of the amazing graffiti artists who defied the huge and powerful corporations that produced and promoted these deadly products and brought about a sweeping change to the way all manner of advertising is presented in Australia, and no doubt saved countless lives as a result. This is the story of B.U.G.A Up. As we just mentioned, in 1970s Australia, tobacco and other advertising was everywhere, indoor, outdoor, in cinemas and on television. Tobacco was also the most advertised product in the world, except for perhaps all food products combined. Food stores were identified by their complete coverage with tobacco ads, from shopfront signage to doormats, and all manner of in-store signage. Huge tobacco advertisements covered the sides of buildings or blared from their rooftops. Freeways and roads had tobacco signs along the way. Billboards were at railway stations and between stops, in train carriages and on buses. There were many members of the medical profession who wrote submissions to have them removed, but this was in vain. The visual environment had become dominated by advertising, and the few regulations that existed were ineffective. Someone had to do something about it. So when did B.U.G.A start? B.U.G.A was created in 1979 by three people: Bill Snow, Rick Bolzen, and Jeff Coleman. They all objected strongly to the hypocrisy of government, the advertising industry, and the legal drug pushers whose advertising plastered our cities and towns, promoting products that were health hazards. Bill Snow, Rick Bolzen, and Jeff Coleman had been attacking billboards with graffiti and paint bombs for more than a year, but felt that a more coordinated campaign was required. Their aim was to reface billboards to provide a truer message than the ones that were being promoted. They decided that to compete against the advertisers, they needed their own branding. This was achieved at one of their strategic planning evenings. That night, they coined the acronym B.U.G.A, which stood for Billboard Utilising Graffitists Against Unhealthy Promotions. From that date, they began signing all billboards with B.U.G.A, and suddenly, what had previously been random graffiti took on a whole new dimension. The advertising industry didn't know what hit them. Their logic was simple, yet brilliant. Advertisements are one-way communication, specifically designed to influence us as consumers. Nowhere is this more obvious than with the ugly billboard advertisements which saturated the urban environment. The products pushed in these ads are often useless or positively harmful to people's health. Yet, as individuals, without corporate resources, they had no effective legal right of reply if they objected to the products themselves or the way in which they were promoted. Billboard graffiti begins a process of two-way communication, creating a dialogue where before there was only an instruction or threat that if we didn't live their lifestyle of booze, fags, and mass consumption, we were somehow inadequate. How many people were in B.U.G.A? The movement grew quickly to about half a dozen, and B.U.G.A held its first public meeting in Sydney in October 1980. Despite the fact that the meeting was poorly advertised, over 50 people attended. They showed slides and discussed their work, and most importantly, recruited new graffiti artists who would put theory into practice. Sometimes evening workshops were held to train new recruits in refacing techniques. Within a couple of years, branches started in Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, and Queensland. In addition, there were many individuals throughout Australia who took up the spray can. Often they were unknown to the state coordinators until they had the misfortune to be arrested. Many of these people are still involved in social activism to this day. How many people were arrested? There were over 20 arrests during the 80s. However, there were far fewer convictions. Some cases were successfully defended and others dismissed by the courts. A lot of paint has sprayed from their cans since the inception of B.U.G.A in October 1979. Since that time, the number of graffiti artists actively involved in B.U.G.A grew from 3 people working in the inner city of Sydney to people working all across Australia and eventually across the entire world. People from 8 to 71 years old were active in B.U.G.A. These included entire families, carpenters, domestic and health workers, graphic artists, hairdressers, taxi drivers, a wrestler, journalists, students, pensioners, research and metal workers, kindergarten teachers, technicians, public servants, unionists and clergy, to name but a few. Originally, The Bugger Up campaign was broadly aimed at all unhealthy billboard advertisements. However, in response to public opinion, they soon focused their attention on tobacco and alcohol promotions, as well as other promotions that were socially and visually assaulting. This was one of the earliest examples of culture jamming in the world, and certainly in Australia, it's given rise to a whole army of anti-corporate protests targeting companies that go against social morals and public safety. Now in the 21st century, the battlegrounds have largely shifted to the online advertising industry, and social media. Spray painting billboards is not so common these days. The Bugger Up movement still exists to this day. They have a website dedicated to the early activists who not only risked arrest, but also personal injury through fence jumping, scaffold climbing, being chased by dogs, as well as copping the dreaded sprayback from spray painting on those cold, windy nights back in the 1980s and 90s. Thanks for listening to this podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to hear more podcasts about the fascinating people and innovations that have helped shape the world we live in, please like this podcast and subscribe to our channel. Bye for now.